Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for another partnership with Machine Learning Healthcare. I'm very, very happy to be here. We're going to be doing a slight tweak in our formula today, both in terms of only working with three panelists, which we are hoping will allow us for a deeper conversation to emerge, but also to having an introductory talk by one of our speakers to kind of bring the topic to life before we start discussing it. As always, if this is your first time in a Meetup AI event, let us know in the chat. But even more important than that, if you're not watching from Berlin, also let us know. Let us know where you're watching from. One of the main advantages of doing the events online now is the ability to be talking to you, whatever you are, and to be able to be sharing our content all over the world. So it's always a big pleasure to see people coming from all over. So none of you actually come here to see me talk. So we come for the speakers. I will be taking a look at all your comments starting now, and we're going to be having rolling Q&A, which means that I will organically be bringing your comments into the conversation. And to properly start the event, I would like to invite our first speaker, Kim Mouridsen, a professor at the Aarhus University, founder and managing director of Surpassed Medical, and the founder at Mindway AI, for a little introduction to his experience in the translation of AI in healthcare. Kim, thank you very much for joining us. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. It's fantastic to be here. So we had a little technical issues. So I have to say next slide whenever I want to see the next slide here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the journey that I have been on and the journey that I'm on, still on, which is basically translating basic research into practice. And I have two examples that I'd like to discuss with you. So one is from radiology. This is where we have founded surpassed Medical. The other one is actually in psychology. So both of them are in healthcare. In psychology, I've looked a lot at problem gambling and how to prevent and intervene as early as possible. So, we can take these two as, two possible journeys in sort of the healthcare space, and then we can discuss, the issues of AI after this. Vince, take the next slide, please. So just to make sure that I get to say everything, here's one slide that basically encapsulates the whole journey. So I've been interested in research and working in research for about 20 years now, mainly in neuroimaging, but also more generally in neuroscience and especially in artificial intelligence. And as you can see here in 2013, I co-founded with Mikkel Bohr Hansen surpassed Medical. This is a medtech company, and what we are doing is using perfusion and other imaging modalities to reduce time to treatment in critical illness, but also many other applications like oncology and dementia. The other journey that I have been on is in 2018. We founded Mindway AI. And as I said, this is really for detection and intervention and also prediction of onset of pathological gambling. This company was partially acquired 2 years ago, and then beginning of this year, this company was fully acquired. So we can also talk a little bit about how to get to an exit scenario. Next slide, please. So just a quick intro to where we come from, and I think this is important also for the discussions that we will have later on. We have a very long tradition here in research dating back at least to 1996, where Leif Østergaard, who is my mentor, basically invented perfusion technology as we know it today on MR and CT scanners. And then multiple research centers later, we founded surpassed Medical, and then even later than that, we founded Mindway AI. So one of the things that we have utilized is that we have a very long tradition of research. We have tons of collaborations that we are very excited about, and it's really standing on the shoulders on that research and these partnerships that we have founded our companies. Next slide, please. Just to give you a flavor, Vince, can you maybe get the next slide? So just to give you a flavor of what's going on here, when you look at the image on the left-hand side, that's a typical vendor image in perfusion imaging. So you can see it's kind of difficult to see that this is actually a stroke patient. There's a lot of scatter and artifacts, and it seems like part of the brain is missing frontally. When you run the same data via the software that we have created. You can see a very distinct lesion here. It's very clear to see. It's very clearly differentiated, against the background. So this is something that will have a big impact on image reading and also on clinical practice. If you take the next slide, then you can see, or just hit forward, then you can see that in CT, such differences can be even bigger. And this is something that would also change the treatment decision for this particular patient. And getting to this point, so I'm not going to go into the technical details, but the way we get here is by basically rethinking some physiology and some physiological modeling, but it's also using AI. And it's really in the intersection between those two disciplines that Surcare Medical is arising. Next slide, please. So really what we are bringing to market with Surcare Medical is a combination of imaging biomarkers that gets us a little bit deeper into tissue properties, and then combined with artificial intelligence. That has a range of advantages as we are entering into the market. Next slide, please. So today we have a fully integrable solution. So we are CE certified. We expecting to and hoping not least to get FDA very soon. So we have a fully implemented system here. It's entirely automated. You basically just have to press one button, then you will see results, and they can integrate at various places at the hospital. And this is really to fit nicely into the hospital workflow. Next slide, please. So the summary of where Surcare Medical is today, we are about 22 employees right now. We have been very fortunate to receive investments by 2 family offices, which is a tremendous advantage for a journey like this one. As I said, we already have ISO certification and CE marking. We're also very active on the research side. We're very active in also trying to attract grants, and we have also been successful there. And then very importantly, we have also been able to establish partnerships with strong partners, strong industries worldwide. And we were also one of the winners of the Philips Global Healthcare Breakthrough a couple of years ago. And we are now entering into the market, as you can see on the upper right-hand corner. Next slide, please. So just to segue over to Mindway, next slide, please. This is a somewhat different story, but the take home is the same. So there are tremendous issues in the gambling space. So gambling operators, they need to be mindful of all the pitfalls and sort of the susceptibility of some individuals to develop addiction. So there's a huge market for any technology that can basically help gambling operators identify problem gambling and then intervene as early as possible. Next slide, please. So what gambling operators need to do is basically to detect, but they also need to do something. So they also need to intervene. And on the next slide, you can see that, what ideally we are after is a fully automated solution. So just like in the radiology space, it needs to be individualized, accommodate to particular gambling styles. We would like to incorporate state-of-the-art scientific knowledge, and we would like it to be explainable, mostly because gambling operators also need to intervene. And then for regulatory purposes, it's important that this is developed by third parties. Next slide, please. So what we have done is basically to try to create a virtual radiologist. So we are basically trying to encode or encapsulate, you could say, all the research that we and our partners and others, of course, around the world have been doing. So we are asking experts worldwide to read through gambling trajectories, and then just like a radiologist make an assessment whether there are signs of ischemia or tumor and tissue and so on, then the psychologist in this case is making an assessment based on raw and you could say organic data, whether there are any signs of addiction. Next slide, please. So it means that what an operator now has is a tool. I don't, this video probably doesn't work. Try to hit the next button, then let's see what happens. Yeah, this is supposed to be an animation where you can see that now basically in a box, we have this tool that can make an assessment of probable gambling addiction, which is completely congruent to what a trained expert in the field would do. Can you get to the next slide? There we go. So again, one of the things that has been important for us is that we are not a one-trick pony, so that we actually offer more than just a single tool. So a single tool, for instance, would be detection. We also offer gamification of self-test. That's also something that relies on psychological and behavioral research and fMRI. And we also offer intervention treatments online. Next slide, please. And then you can see here in 2021, we were fully acquired, and you can also see some of the awards that we were fortunate to receive. So we have got a lot of recognition on this journey. So before we get to the discussion, there were a couple of points that I'd like to make as quickly as possible. Vince, I don't know if you can get to the next slide. Yes. So I'm a statistician by training, and having followed and been in the field for about 20 years, it's interesting to see how AI is often pitched as something that's entirely new, because that's not really the case when you compare to traditional statistics, classical statistics in the sense of Fisher, for instance, and Nyman and Pearson. There are a lot of similarities, and it turns out that you can actually quite quickly make sort of a classical statistical problem into an AI problem. So if you take a look at the graph to the left, you can see this is really the classical, and all of us, have been or are working in research have seen this plot. So you have two conditions, or you have two groups, and you're trying to compare these two mean values, and you're basically asking if they're statistically different. And so this is given that you know which the groups are, or which group a particular observation is from. Now you can turn this into a predictive or a classification problem basically by inverting this. So if instead you say, now I know the value of an observation, and now my task is to predict or classify which of the two groups did this particular observation belong to. And I would claim that in many respects, this is actually a stronger question or a harder question. So we are not relying on sample size analysis, power size, or power analysis. This is really brute force information content in the data you're looking at as a way of classifying into different groups, different diseases, different response to diseases, and so on. If you take the next slide, then sort of the reproducibility questions that arise in artificial intelligence and in healthcare, we have seen exactly the same, and we are seeing exactly the same with classical statistics. So there are questions about how reproducible is science, especially in healthcare, and there are big problems there that need to be addressed, and I could make a whole presentation about that alone. But this is just to say that this is not new to AI. This is something we have seen for a long, long time. Next slide, please, Vince. What you can see here, so the graphics messed up here a little bit. I'll see if I can make the screen a little bit bigger so I can also see it. So we performed, this is actually in some work by Circ here. We actually went out and asked, a host of radiologists from around the globe, not necessarily our customers, but, just in general, what's their perception on AI? And I think this is really important that, almost unanimously radiologists are saying, we want this. So you can read through these quotations here, but some pertain to freeing up manpower, the realization that there's just so much data out there, and it's likely that we miss connections in the data. It's to reduce workload. It's to counter the fact that fewer students are actually choosing radiology now, probably also due to the citations by Jeff Hinton and so on. They can be hardware driven. Some see it as a second opinion. So I think many radiologists are interested in the field. Next slide, please. What's really important, and this is part of the discussion I guess we'll be having today, what are the roadblocks here, and how can we validate the technology, and we'll talk a lot about the metrics and the procedures and so on. What we are also seeing is that there's a tremendous interest and I would say a necessity to try this out in radiologists' own departments. So getting a feel for the software, building trust in the software by actually using it. So you could say, let's call it real world evidence. So it doesn't necessarily need to be systematic. What many of these people are actually saying is that, we want to see it in action, but we don't necessarily trust, you could say, neither the science really, nor of course claims by a company. But we'd actually like to see that it works on our side with our patient cohort, with the indications that we typically work with, which I think is very healthy also. And next slide, and I think that's probably the last one. So this is to address the question, because we have I would say, a pretty long scientific tradition in circular and also in Mindway. But as you can see also from these I put quotes here by radiologists, having strong science is not necessarily a unique selling point. It's more of an assumption out there in the wild. So it's an assumption that these companies, AI companies, have done the research. But and then despite the fact that the research has been done, then there's still an overwhelming need and a requirement actually to try this out on people's own data. So just to give a little bit of perspective, and from some recent work we have done on how do we get to implement AI in healthcare, there are many interesting questions. So I look forward to discussing this.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Kim, for this introduction to your work and to already giving a taste of what translation in healthcare from a product perspective. I would like to also invite on stage our two other panelists for tonight. So Dr. Ishita Barua, who is an MD and PhD candidate at the University and right now a Fulbright scholar at Harvard Medical, and Kicky van Leeuwen, a PhD candidate at the Radboud University Hospital and the creator of AI for radiology.com, which is something that we're going to be talking in a quick second. Thank you very much, Ishita, and thank you very much, Kicky, for joining. And let's just jump straight out with a bit of a controversial question. So we heard Kim talking about bringing a product to market. Both of you, Ishita and Kicky, you see this more from let's say the academic and the hospital point of view. But this is a question for the whole panel. In how many years do you think we will have AI being widely available and used inside the clinical setting and being efficient at its work? Who wants to take that first, Kicky or Ishita?
You should choose, Nicholas. You cannot.
All right, so I'm gonna give it to you, Kicky. I'm gonna give it to you. I want to see who comes up with the highest number.
Social dynamics online.
Yeah, you cannot do that. You will talk all through each other. No, so I think this question already comes from an assumption that we're not there yet. And I think that is not really true anymore. So it's not like the field has been standing still in the past years, luckily. So we've performed now 2 years in a row a survey in the Netherlands on which hospitals use what kind of AI products, and really based on those that are commercially available that you can buy. So not the typical academic algorithms that are still in research departments, but really those that are used daily in clinical practice. And what we see is from last year to this year, it almost doubled already in the amount of hospitals that actually have AI, and also the amount of products that they use has also largely increased. So now in the Netherlands, we have 70 hospital organizations, and there are 23 at least that we know of that have it. So that's already at least 25%. So it's there. Whether it's widely used, that's maybe a different question. So it's a lot of pioneering still, trying things out. But it's definitely there. And then if you talk about useful, so to also provide a short comment on that, that's of course a tricky question. When is AI really useful? Is that when the doctor likes it? Is that when a patient gets better because of it? Or should it be maybe even cost effective? So should it really reduce the healthcare costs? So we're not there yet. That evidence is still, I think, very thin.
That's a very, very good point. Ishita, what about your thoughts?
Actually, Kicky put it very well. The question about when are we going to see AI in the clinic is dependent on when is AI going to actually result in meaningful outcomes for the patients. And so we are not there yet, because in Norway, at least, we're not using, where I'm from, sorry, we're not using any AI tools in patient care. So it's only being used and utilized in research. And I think that it will take, if I may come up with an estimate, I think it will take a couple of years, actually, because the thing is, the clinic is actually waiting for clinical validation, and it's only just begun. It's very premature, this field, AI in medicine. A lot of hype in the mainstream media. It makes it almost sound like this is something that we are ready to use, at least from the perspective of Norwegian newspapers. So we're not using it yet. We're just waiting for the clinical validation. And that's when we can start thinking about when it will be implemented. I think it will take a couple of years, like 5 years, something like that.
5 years doesn't sound too bad. As somebody who is already putting AI in the hands of doctors, but at the same time, I imagine that you're still facing a lot of implementation issues when it comes to deploying it and bringing up partners. How do you feel about this question? Do you think that we're already there? Do you think that we still need the field to mature a bit? That's not.
I guess you were asking me that my connection is also freezing up a little bit, but so I would, maybe also challenge the question and then say, I think there's already AI out there, and I think it's been there for a long time. So it also depends on what it is what are you requiring? So this is again going back to the fact that when we think of AI as something entirely new, then of course going forward it's going to take years. And I think when we say AI, we typically think about deep learning. But AI came out, depending on how you use the slogans, came out of machine learning. And machine learning, again, came out of, classical statistics and computer science engineering and so on. So, these algorithms have been in place for a long, long time. And I think another way to phrase the question is, when do we start to get an advantage from deep learning? And so deep learning, in a sense, just means that we can use data in a more organic fashion. So where previously we had to do a lot of feature engineering, so I guess I, lost the first 10 years of my career doing feature extraction in, images and so on. And I was completely blown away when I saw the potential for artificial intelligence in the sense of deep learning, because now we basically only had to think about the architecture of the network. But going from there and then to show clinical value is probably a question of in which cases does it make sense to do a more careful and organic analysis of data.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And I think it would be worth it to bring that question back to Kicky, actually, because Kicky, you actually did some research also on how long it takes to actually in radiology and AI. And I think we're going to come to one of the main questions of tonight as well, validation, which I know is a topic to you. Back to you, Kicky.
Yeah. So maybe I should introduce also what we've done with AI for radiology.com. So it's a website where we gather products that are CE certified. So those are commercially available for the European market for radiology. And we can request also the vendors to also deliver product information to us. Also for Surcare, we have listed there. But with all this data, we can also get a good view of the market. So what we looked at is how long it takes for vendors to come up with their first product onto the market. And that was almost 4 years. And so it takes 4 years from a company to be founded till their first product being commercially available. And usually there's a PhD in front of that. So it's usually arises from academia. So you could add up another 4 years at least for someone who has been working on that intensively. But if we could put that into perspective with drugs, for example, or with other technical innovations, it's about 17 years. So 4 years sounds like a long time if you're not into healthcare. If you are in healthcare, 4 years might be a very short time. So it's all context related, these numbers.
Super interesting. Actually, a very, very good point. And then let's think about here also about one of the big problems when people are talking about the gap, the translational gap in healthcare. Just like you said, something that people often think, if you're not in healthcare, that it might sound like a lot, but it's not. There's another point, which is regulation. And there's a common perception in the startup world that regulation kind of kills off good ideas because people are not willing to put in with the regulatory burden. So I'm going to actually send that one to Ishita first to ask for her thoughts about how she sees regulation. And then Kim, I'm probably going to be following up with you so that you know ahead. Ishita?
Yes, thank you for the question. A very good one. So I think that we need to find middle ground when it comes to regulation. We need to have enough regulation so that we don't endanger our patients, but at the same time, we don't want to strangle innovation, right? So that is why I think that, for instance, regulatory sandbox for responsible AI development that Norway and UK has been implementing, at least, I think that's the way to go. So the Norwegian Data Protection Agency has introduced a regulatory sandbox following the British model. And the sandbox establishes a project environment for AI where private and public companies can get free guidance on personal data protection. And the goal of the initiative is actually to promote the development of innovative AI solutions that are ethical and responsible. And it will also help organizations implement privacy by design solutions and enable the compliance with the EU General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. So in this way, companies will have the opportunity to gain greater insights into personal data protection and the opportunity to develop products that can be a win for not only the company, but also for individuals, the society, and for the data protection agency. So that's the way to go. So I think that my main answer to this is that we have to find a middle ground. Too much is not good. It's not good. And too little will endanger the patients, I'm afraid.
It's a very, very good point. And I think a lot of people kind of think about less regulation rather than better regulation sometimes. And that's what you're saying, was maybe to create better regulation or to create other support systems. Kim, when you were going through your startup adventure, I imagine that you came better prepared than most, given that your background before that. But how was the regulatory burden for you? Was this something that held you back? Was that something that you were completely prepared for? How do you feel about it? How was it?
It's an excellent question, and there are so many answers. I had to write a couple of them down just to remember. But I think the main take is that there are very good reasons that there is strong regulatory control, and this is something we need to acknowledge, something we need to respect. It's there for good reasons. Sometimes, AI algorithms come very close to automated decision making. We would oftentimes claim that they don't. That's not the promise of many companies, but we also know that maybe that's what's going to happen in the real world, at least at some sites. So we need to be careful. I think that there are two components. One is if you're developing a software for a hospital, there are general requirements and rules, quality assurance for developing software. And that's one we don't get around that, whether we are talking AI or any other kind of software system that needs to run in a hospital. So that's one thing, and there's just no way around it. And if I had to probably upset most researchers around the world, let me just take myself as an example. My code was pretty messy when I started developing AI solutions. So I hugely appreciate that we have regulatory control, and fortunately also better programmers than me doing all the bits and the bytes. The next question then is, and because this is something that also can make me sleep at night now, because I know that we are following a lot of procedures, and we have a yearly maintenance audit of all procedures basically. The other part of that question is what is particular to AI? So what are the particular regulatory requirements for AI? And if I had to sort of say in one sentence what is most important for me, would be that there's sufficient and sufficiently diverse data available. So I think this data diversity is cannot really be underestimated, because this is a number one reason probably that when AI fails, it's because it's seeing cases it didn't see before, so they were not in the training cohort. So sampling large enough data sets, getting access, which is can be painful in itself, but I think that's probably one of the biggest obstacles for in a regulatory sense for AI.
Ishita, I'll be sending you the question about data in a second. But before that, I want to actually bridge a topic that it was super surprising for me when I was talking to all of you before the talk, and which is the difference between actually passing regulatory approval and actually passing the bar for implementation inside of hospitals. So Kicky, if I might pick your brain on this one, could you let us know a bit of the difference between the certified product and a product that has been, let's say, validated through, let's say, the golden standard for medical products or for products that go into the medical setting?
Yeah, so I think Kim also is an expert on this, but for certification, it's really risk-based. So you don't get a certification for being a great product or for having a great performance, but you get certification for complying to the rules. and having, as Kim mentioned, the procedures in place to sort of quality check that your product's doing what it's supposed to be doing. But that doesn't mean it gets tested like, hey, this is really going to add value to your hospital setting. So is it really going to make patients better? Is it going to save money? And this is, I think, what is often mistakenly assumed, that once there's a mark on that, whether it's FDA or CE, it's going to be useful for clinical practice. And I think when buying AI, physicians need to be very aware of what they are trying to reach, what goal they're trying to reach with that AI product, because they are the ones to be critical on that. The notified bodies that give you CE mark or the FDA is not going to be critical on that.
Very, very good point, Kicky. And I'm going to be taking a question from the audience as well, from Gryfx here, asking, many certified products are really badly validated. Why do regulators not understand AI in healthcare? And Ishita, I think this question has your name straight up written on it. So you're going to be taking it. And you might as well also already elucidate for us a bit, how does the validation for an AI and healthcare product differ from, let's say, other types of products?
Yes. Okay. So I will touch upon that. So I will start by saying that today we have mostly traditional in silico evaluation of AI. In silico meaning research performed on computer or via computer simulation. And increased scrutiny of AI applications in healthcare highlights the need for real-world evaluation for effectiveness and unintended consequences. So the complexity of healthcare, compounded by the user and context-dependent nature of AI applications, calls for a multifaceted approach beyond in silico evaluation. And I believe the lack of validation of clinical AI tools from prospective studies. Prospective study is, just to explain it a bit for those who do not know, it's sort of a cohort study, a group study where participants are enrolled into the study before they develop the disease or outcome in question. The opposite is a retrospective study where researchers enroll people who already have the disease or the condition. And so prospective studies, typically they last a few years, with some even lasting for decades. So it's more difficult to do prospective studies, which could in some ways explain why retrospective studies are preferred. And yes, and so the lack of validation of clinical AI tools from prospective studies, that's a challenge that doctors and healthcare professionals with domain knowledge, they need to address this and speak up about it, because our colleagues, especially outside of the medical field, they don't have an intuitive understanding of why it is important to do prospective studies. So even though you have something that is FDA approved, CE marked, like it's been mentioned, it's not necessarily a green light for using it in a clinical setting at a hospital. At least from my experience in European hospitals in Norway, for instance, even though something is CE marked, the doctors, the clinicians are hesitant to use an AI tool because that just means that it's been validated for most part on retrospective data. But what is the clinical outcome? That's not been validated good enough for most of the AI algorithms, that is. And also, I think that there are so many aspects about clinical medicine that are unique and differs from other industries and fields. So that understanding of why it is so important to have clinical validation, it's something that I think doctors need to speak up about. And for instance, with drugs and vaccines, we require clinical validation. We do RCTs to actually prove that this drug or this vaccine is effective, right? So why don't we have that for AI tools? That's the big or the $1 million question. So we cannot expect less of AI tools than we can of drugs and vaccines. So I think that prospective studies is the way to go. I think that's what we need to address in the future, in the coming years.
Very, very good point, Ishita. Kicky, if you want to kind of follow up on that. And also I want to make a mention here to Stefan Gilbert, who's really killing in the comments. Thank you very much, Stefan, for providing your views on this. And Stefan is also meaning here that compliance requires establishment of clinical benefit in the EU. So, but Kicky, your point.
Yeah, so I would like to continue on or maybe counter a bit what Ishita said, because I think clinical validation is important, but there's also another side of the coin, so kind of a danger, because if for every AI tool we're going to do randomized clinical trials or large prospective trials for years, the costs are going to be enormous. So of course there's a reason why we don't, or why these trials aren't there yet, because they're just very, very expensive and they take a long time. And I think the risk with that is that, I mean, for AI to be of value and efficient, there's also a cost to it. So there should be a benefit maybe for care, but also at some point it needs to be affordable. So I think we need to be critical on what validation is needed for what product to be safe. And that might not always have to be these huge trials. So if, for example, to give an example in radiology, there's an AI tool that can measure the volume of a lung nodule in a picture, in an image. That's something a physician already does. That's what a radiologist already does. If we can prove standalone that that algorithm is at least as good as the radiologist, then I assume that the impact will be the same as if the radiologist does it or the AI. But if we talk, for example, about biomarkers, that an AI predicts something that is new and that a radiologist doesn't do yet, and it's a new factor that we take into consideration for deciding the treatment, then of course we should figure out whether these decisions are going to change because of this new biomarker, because of this new information, and whether patients are going to come out better. So I think depending on what the AI is doing, you should determine what is needed, because otherwise the costs for AI are going to be too high.
And of course, Ishita, I was going to give you the right of the reprisal.
Thank you. I completely agree, and I do see the problem that it's going to take too much resources and time also. But at the same time, just look at the COVID vaccine. Like normally a vaccine would take anywhere between 10 and 15 years to develop. But right now we're doing it in like less than a year. So this is something that we can do maybe faster with time. But I don't think that the proof of burden should be, I think that you should still put the patient in focus, that it should be tried out in a manner that is safe. So we should still try to seek, I think that the important thing here, the keyword is study design. So it needs to be meaningful. It doesn't have to be an RCT every time, but a prospective study, I don't think we can bypass that in order for implementation into the clinics.
Especially if we, by bypassing that, you kind of escape from the first wall of the regulatory approval, but then you crash on the second wall of actually being accepted inside of the clinical practices, right? And Kim, actually, I was going to throw a different question to you, but also based on this, because a lot of companies first think about how effective my algorithm is going to be. Can I pass regulatory approval? But you've been there in the trenches, putting a product to market. What else is there to make a successful AI in healthcare product?
So I usually think that the AI bit is really a feature. It's a small part to the end user that sits inside a very big workflow. We during the survey that we conducted, I almost got the feeling that if you want to sell something AI related, don't call it AI. So there is a kind, or you could say, of AI fatigue in the field. So I'm old enough that I saw, part of the beginning years, let's say 10 years ago. At that time, it was, I think, frowned upon to suggest that we would be using AI in healthcare. Many people and physicians that I speak to now say, why don't we have it already? And why is it not working? And now we have this discussion, why are we not already there? And what are the roadblocks? So something went wrong. And I think some of the hype, I think we overhyped it, we overpromised. And we're at a point where there's sort of a feature race to say, our AI solution will, if not cure cancer, then close to that. It's going to better the lives of patients and so on. So many products actually, and many companies, and without mentioning any names, actually make these claims. And as Ishita is saying, that really bodes for, strict RCTs to make claims like that. And I also agree that is going to be expensive. And I think, taking maybe a slightly different perspective, that of an investor. And I think many investors today would say, let's go into AI because the road to a successful product is much shorter than in pharma, for instance. In pharma, it takes 10 years and it costs, $1 billion. Nobody believes that it takes that long time and you have to, go through that many problems in artificial intelligence. So to make a long story short, I think, overhyped, overpromised. actually, let's stop calling it AI and then just focus on making nice, efficient workflows for physicians. And then whether it's AI or anything else, they don't really care.
Very, very good point. Kim, I'm going to stay on you for a second there because we have a question from Ashish Singh asking if we should be integrating more data science AI into the medical training and education. And as your professor, I would like to start off with you and then open up a bit for the panel and a quick answer on that. Ashish, what you also might be interested is that our last event here with Machine Learning Healthcare was exactly on that topic. So we have a beautiful discussion about this already. Maybe our colleagues at Machine Learning Healthcare can also add the link to the comments. But Kim, how do you feel? Should we be teaching more AI inside of universities?
Yeah, as yes, I couldn't agree more. It's so important, and maybe I'm predicting, but I've that there was a recent survey that showed that radiologists who are informed about AI tend to accept it better and use it more. So of course there's also this kind of new kid in the class, or a new kid on the block effect, that this is new, and some people are saying that it's going to steal jobs and so on. So of course there's a hesitation. I'm a big believer actually that you can teach AI to students who don't have a PhD in mathematics or statistics. The concepts are intuitive, and they're also very healthy. And I think it follows quite nicely from standard biostatistics courses. We are not afraid to teach people about p-values, and I think a p-value is intuitively much more difficult to understand than a cross-validation. A cross-validation says something about what is the anticipated reproducibility. If you look at a p-value, it's really a probability of observing something that's more inconsistent with the null hypothesis than what you're actually observing. So really difficult to understand, and there's probably also part of the reproducibility crisis that I mentioned in the introduction. If you look at the connection between p-values and reproducibility, you would think many researchers would believe that a p-value around 5% means that a study is very likely to be reproduced if it's under the same conditions. It turns out that probability at the level of 5% is actually 50%. So it's 50-50 whether you can reproduce it or not. And then if you combine that with if I could sort of draw a histogram in the air here over, p-values in scientific publications, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that here where I'm drawing the peak, this is 5%. And then it falls off extremely quickly, So there are probably also many of those studies who are, 5.5% really. So there's a huge bias there and a huge problem in reproducibility. So I think if we start to teach the principles of AI with cross-validation, out of sample testing, generalizability, how does this work out in the wild? A little bit about the technology, but that's, I wouldn't say so important unless you're going to produce your own algorithms, but getting a feeling for it, being able to read papers, understanding level of evidence, and also seeing through some of the claims made by some companies.
That's a very, very good point, Kim. And I'm going to be opening a similar version of that question to Ishita and Kicky, which also, because here we're speaking about educating, let's say, students, but what about educating doctors? What about educating doctors who are already in the field? And I'm going to be playing the devil advocate here a bit and asking, is old-fashioned doctors also a big reason on why AI is not being more widely implemented? So I'm going to give that question first to Ishita and then to Kicky. Ishita, your thoughts?
Well, for doctors and clinicians to support the implementation of AI, I think the burden of proof, like I said before, it lies with the research environment to actually prove a clinical significant outcome of AI tools being used in the clinic. So for the doctors who are already doctors today and for future doctors, I think that we should start addressing this topic to young medical minds right now, or those who are in the clinic already, in a way that we need to give them the tools to understand, like Kim was saying, what is AI? And I don't think that it's necessarily, it doesn't have to be like programming. It's not on that level. They need to understand on a very basic level the concept of AI, how it can be utilized in the clinic, what it can do and what it cannot do. And sort of like, because the doctors are going to use it as a clinical decision tool, so they need to understand it. So both for medical students and the doctors today, they need to be coursed and well-versed in AI technology, but not on the level of like programming. That's not what we need. If they do so, that's fine. But I think that they need to have a basic concept and understanding of that right now, actually.
Very, very good point. Kicky?
Yeah, I think this is a similar discussion to a lot of technology we have, of course, in the hospital. I mean, technology is not new. If we look at what happened in the past decades with the imaging modalities like MRI, and there's no doctor that can build an MRI system, but they need to understand what it does and what they're looking at to give a good clinical interpretation. So indeed, I think also it's more about how to use it. And a nice example that I saw or heard about that illustrates this, I think, is, for example, in AI tool that does breast cancer screening, but also different kinds of screening, is what physicians that were trying that, there was a large cancer that was missed by the AI. And doctors were like, but this is so obvious, how can the AI miss this? And they immediately sort of reject the algorithm because it's crap, because it misses like these very large tumors. But if you understand the concept of deep learning and how it works, and if you know it was trained for screening data, which means when it's on women with with screening breast cancer, you don't expect to find any very large tumors because you hope to have found them in an earlier screening stage or in an earlier scan. So if you understand that concept, that it wasn't trained for these large nodules or these large malignancies, then also the physician is more likely to accept these kind of mistakes instead of rejecting them.
And I want to give it. That's a very good point.
It's like we're going for the classical.
No. But this is exactly what I like. So Kim, I'm gonna be giving the word to you first, and then Ishita, you can take it. Kim.
No, I just wanted to comment. I fully agree with you guys. So I was not going to make any contradictions here, but the debate has a little bit it's either or. So either it's the AI or it's the physician, and the way we are having the discussion here, we are sort of implying that the AI is fully automated and we call it a decision tool. It's really an aid to making decisions. So it's a decision support tool. And I think that the best question, when are we going to get to a point where AI plus a human, so AI plus a radiologist? So think of it as an extended radiologist. There's a lot of talk about bias in AI. So AI can get biased, and there are a lot of funny examples of that. If one thing, since I'm also working a little bit with psychology, I'm also interested in the biases we humans possess. If you go to Wikipedia, you will see a list of like 185 different named biases and those are sort of our own blind spots. And yes, they also pertain to experts. Of course, you can dial it down, but we have so many biases, and so you're also going to see bias in AI due to data skewness and so on. But I think if you think of it more as a Swiss cheese, so that's also been used in COVID. So human is going to catch something, AI is going to catch something, and altogether you have a better safety net under the patient or the gambler.
Oh, you're muted, Nicholas.
Yes, unfortunately, my mouse stopped working for a second, but now I got it back. No, I was just going to say second pair of eyes, right? That's often how people talk about decision support systems inside of healthcare and AI, to be a second, just like a physician would have a second opinion, to always have a second opinion running. But Ishita, you wanted to kind of comment as well.
Yes, it's not a contradiction to what Kicky said. It's actually, I totally agree. And actually from in Norway, in the University of Oslo, we just established a medical subject, an elective subject that is actually addressing this. It's called AI innovation, big data, and clinical decision support. Very long name for a small subject, but still. So we're actually giving the medical students the choice to choose this subject and then learn how to use AI, what the status of AI is right now. But also make it a point to focus on how to detect bias, how the foundation, the data is actually skewed and may not have all the details that we need. And also, I think that is the important main key message from that subject actually to know how it is used, but especially to question what is the data, and maybe the bias or the black box can be found there. So they are learning these tools actually, and we hope, and hopefully more and more universities will actually offer this kind of subjects and courses. Yes, so I just wanted to second what Kicky said actually.
No, very good points. Actually, I just want to bring a point from Stephen again. I'm not sure actually if any of you will be able to comment because it's a very short-term news. But there is a leaked draft from the European Commission on regulating AI, and Kim is asking if you think that this will make a difference in the EU playing field in AI. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to read the draft. I actually have it open in another tab, but I didn't read it. So unless somebody has done it, Stephen, I just wanted to mention that we saw it and that we are aware. But because this kind of came out, I think, a couple of days ago, it's likely that nobody has seen it. I am with agreement of the panel then. Great. Then I want to slowly bring the panel to its last questions. And something that we really like to do in Meetup AI is to be able to give advice for startups and for people kind of joining this field. And then I would like first to ask him another question, and is for him to share a hard lesson that he learned by creating, let's say, an AI in healthcare startup, actually two AI in healthcare startups. Is there, like, you came in already knowing quite a lot, Kim, I'm sure, but was there a hard lesson that you learned, let's say, again, on the trenches?
So I would say I knew nothing when I started. I come from statistics. I work with measure theory, which is so theoretical that, I cannot even remember it. So I knew basically nothing about healthcare, nor regulatory control, nor business. So as you can see, I lost all my hair on the journey. So it's been tough, and I would say, probably the one thing that's, that I've learned, and it's really important and a good advice. Kicky has the statistics, but it's really the fact that things take time. It takes tremendous time to develop these algorithms. I would recommend, to new companies, people who have ideas, think in terms of solutions. In other words, I saw a quote, fall in love with the solution, don't fall in love with the problem. So, you can fall in love with a problem that, is not really a problem outside your own bubble. So solving relevant questions, and use AI if it's relevant. If it's not relevant, forget about it and then just call it something else.
It's a very, very good point. And before we actually have our final question for the full panel, I have a question to Kicky, and that is on, there's a lot of talk that startups just don't know how to work inside of hospitals, and they just don't know how to work straight with doctors. And do you think that there is a role to be played by integrators or like big platforms and marketplaces to be able to bridge this gap maybe between, let's say, the plucky startup and the traditional hospital?
Yeah, definitely. So I think what you say about that they don't know about the medical field, I think that has changed a lot as well. So when the first startups came, they were a lot from the tech industry, and they thought, hey, healthcare is an area to disrupt. But by now, there's doctors who are working in these companies, and it's more mature. So I do think that there's more understanding there. But what you do see coming up now, which I think is very interesting for the ones that want to stay tech focused, is indeed that there's marketplaces coming up that actually take away some of the things you have to do to really integrate it well into clinical practice. So they provide the interface, they provide the integration to the other software in their hospital. And I think this would really allow companies to focus on the algorithms itself more. So I think there's the market is still moving in that sense. I think there's going to be startups that's going to disappear. There's maybe going to be startups that are really going to focus on the core and really on the algorithms only, and have other parties doing the integration and maybe also the clinical validation. So we'll see where that's going to head.
That's a very, very good point. So to close off the panel, I have a final question for each one of you. And the question is, what advice would you give right now for a startup coming into the medical field, like an AI startup coming into the medical field? Let's start up with Ishita, then Kim, then Kicky, you to close up.
My advice would be, if you already have an algorithm, if you already have an AI tool that you believe in, I think that very early on, if you have not already done that, try to include and seek the advice of clinicians. Because sometimes when you have an algorithm, the way it is supposed to work is not the way it will work in the clinic. It's a very different field. And often doctors can seem very conservative, but there's a very good reason for that. So I think that very early on, you should try to talk to doctors and talk to those who are going to use that algorithm. This goes without saying, but still, I think a lot of startups maybe not be so aware of how the hospital environment is. So that would be my advice: seeking out medical experts and domain experts in the field if they have not already done that, and also try to do actually prospective studies. It will be costly. This will take resources, but it will, in the end, I think this will make the implementation easier.
Very good point, Ishita. Kim, your words.
Thank you, Niklas. Yeah, so in addition to what I said before, I totally agree with Dr. Ishita. Talking to physicians. So I would say the strategy of failing fast. So get the product out there, do a mock-up, even if it's just a PowerPoint. Go out there and show it to physicians. Learn. It's really important that you accommodate to the market. So don't expect the market to accommodate to whatever you're bringing. Make sure you have something that solves a real problem. And then I'd probably also say make a budget, and also talk to people who are experienced in business, because it's going to take funding, it's going to take money. Think about what you would like to do with your career. Do you want to be full-time in a company? One thing I've been very fortunate to do is to basically have my position in academia, and then do commercial things on the side, and that's been extremely helpful.
Very good point. And then Kicky, as the final words of the panel.
Thanks. Yeah, I think if you want to start something now, I must admit, I would say it's a bit late, maybe. So there's our in radiology. Oh, sorry, I have to give a disclaimer to that. So my field of view is radiology. So I think a lot in the other healthcare sectors, there's a lot to gain, but in radiology, there's more than 150 products out there already. So the market's pretty saturated. It's being said a lot, it's starting to get saturated. So if you're going to start now, it's going to take you at least 4 years to get that first product, right? And then there's these companies already out there that have the infrastructure to move fast. So of course, I'm being honest. You said it right, Nicholas. I'm Dutch, so I can be there.
Indeed.
So no, I think for radiology, I think, so if you want to still move into that field, I would advise you to find partners that can make you move up to speed, to get you up to speed. So get these integration partners on board, get clinical validation partners, move with hospitals quick, so they can help you out there. So to get up to speed with these other companies. So this is really something from the radiology point of view where there's a lot happening already. For other fields within healthcare, I think there is still a lot of open waters to be explored, and there's enough opportunities there to start a company, to give a positive note in the end.
No, it's a very good point, Kicky. I just reminded something from economics that says that the only people that made money in the gold rush were the people selling mining supplies. So if there is a gold rush going into AI and radiology, maybe providing a service to those companies it makes you more money and a better business than anything else. Kim, then make a last mention, and then I'm wrapping up.
It's so interesting what you're saying, Kicky. That there are definitely so many companies there. On the other hand, I just read a couple of days ago, there are about 10,000 conditions that give us symptoms. So from that perspective, yes, there's still a lot to be done.
Maybe there's multiple gold rushes going on. And with that, I'm actually closing the panel, and I want to thank each one of our speakers. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you, the community, for sharing your questions and watching us. Stay tuned. There's always more content coming up from this partnership that we have with Machine Learning Healthcare. Check out Meetup AI. Check out the YouTube from Machine Learning Healthcare. And don't forget to subscribe, because there's already so much content over here on this topic. Vince, thank you for the very nice introduction and for the invitation. The stage is again yours.
For a very brief thank you to all speakers, and also to you, Nico, for moderating. I think this was very, very insightful, and I really hope that you at home enjoyed this stream. And with these final words, thanks a lot and bye-bye.